Victory smelled of hot metal and opened hives. It smelled of blasters scoring on sandstone, of cauterized flesh, of oil boiling in shattered battle droids, and of the faint sweet tang that came when Geonosian warrens were cracked open, and their hidden chambers breathed their centuries of dust into the pitiless sun. Long after the last great line of droids had fallen, and the gunships had turned away to chase the fleeing columns across the desert, that smell hung over the arena and the foundries beyond it like a second atmosphere, thick enough to taste. Anakin Skywalker sat on a toppled girder outside Count Dooku's abandoned hangar and tried not to look at the place where his right arm ended. The stump was sealed and bandaged, white wrapping already blotched through with a dark rose stain at the elbow. Medics had offered another round of painkillers, but he had refused them with the stubborn, juvenile contempt of a boy who still believed pain only counted if someone else saw him bear it. Now the world came to him with exquisite sharpness. He could hear clone medics moving between the wounded. He could hear the tiny clicking death rattles of Geonosians buried under collapsed stone. He could hear Padmé speaking in a low voice to a trooper whose helmet was off, her hand pressed against the side of his face while she kept him with her by force of tone alone until the stretcher came. He could hear his own blood in his ears, beating out the memory of Dooku's blade. Across from him, Obi-Wan Kenobi had seated himself with much more dignity on the remains of a crate that had once held munitions for the droid armies. One leg was stretched out before him. His shoulder and thigh had both been cut, and though he hid pain with that unflappable composure Anakin had spent 10 years alternately admiring and resenting, his face was leached pale beneath the dust. His beard was singed on one side. There was a rip in his sleeve where a lightsaber had grazed cloth and skin together. He had accepted the medic's back-to-patch for his leg, but ignored the rest of their fussing, which usually meant he was thinking too hard to notice he was bleeding. Padmé came back from the trooper and stood between them, shadowing Anakin from the brutal light for a moment. The skin of her shoulders showed through a tear in her white outfit. Red dust had settled into the cloth and made her look as though she had been carved from marble and left out in weather for years. There were scratches along one arm from the arena beasts. Her hair had half fallen from its fastening. She looked, Anakin thought with a sudden ache almost worse than the severed arm, as if she had been through a war. Perhaps that was what made him laugh under his breath, a harsh, broken sound. Obi-Wan glanced up. "Something amusing?" he asked. Anakin looked out at the horizon, where plumes of black smoke rose from the foundries and merged into the reddish sky. "No," he said. "Just wondering whether this is what a good day looks like." Padmé's expression softened, but there was iron in it too. "The Republic survived today," she said. "For now," Obi-Wan murmured, and there was such private weight in the words that both of them looked at him. Anakin knew why. The question had been hanging between them since the duel in the hangar, though neither of them had touched it yet. Dooku's voice still lived in the air of that place. "What if I told you the Republic was now under the control of a Dark Lord of the Sith? What if I told you he was named Darth Sidious?" Dooku had said it to Obi-Wan on Geonosis, like a confession or a temptation, or a joke too elegant to reveal itself at once. The Council had heard reports before of whisper cults, dark adepts, fallen Jedi, hidden schools, all the debris that clung to a galaxy old enough to remember its own nightmares. But there had been something in Obi-Wan's eyes after Dooku spoke. Something unsettled, not convinced but no longer wholly dismissive. Then the battle had begun, then the arena, then the charge, then the hangar, then Yoda's arrival, and afterward there had been only survival. R2-D2 rolled over the broken threshold of the hangar with a charred data spindle held in one manipulator. C-3PO flapped after him, joints whining. "Oh. Honestly," 3PO said, his golden plating filmed dull with dust. "Must he handle everything as if it were a prize in a junk market? Master Anakin, I assure you that object is burned beyond any polite use." R2 shrilled something indignant and extended the spindle higher. Obi-Wan's gaze sharpened. "Where did he get that?" R2 answered with a volley of beeps and a rotating projection of the corridor beyond the hangar. "Ancillary chamber, partly collapsed, hidden behind blast-blackened durasteel. Anakin frowned. There wasn't anything there. There is now, Obi-Wan said, pushing himself upright with a wince. Or there was before our friend's curiosity got to it. Come along? Padmé moved to help him, but Obi-Wan gave her a little shake of the head and limped inside without protest. Only when Anakin rose too, jaw locked against the protesting fire that ran through his shoulder. The chamber R2 had found was narrow and low, half storage alcove, half communications niche. Geonosian glyphs were clawed into the walls in neat vertical strips. Most of the equipment had been slagged by a detonator charge, but not all. One projector dish hung half-melted from its mount. A transmitter array had fused into a grotesque metal bloom. On the floor lay the kind of scorched circle blast teams left behind when they were in a hurry and wanted to make certain memory became smoke. Obi-Wan crouched beside the ruined dish. His fingertips hovered over a line of carbon scoring at its base. Someone tried to erase this after a transmission, he said. Recently. Anakin leaned against the wall. Of course they did. Dooku ran .key. He cleaned the room on the way out. No. Obi-Wan looked at the burn pattern again, and his tone went distant with thought. Not clean. Rushed. There's a difference. R2 slid the data spindle into a socket on his own chassis and projected a stuttering lattice of fractured light. Most of it was static. Then, in one brief jag of image, a cloaked figure appeared in blue distortion, hood deep, face all but lost in shadow. Beside the figure, visible only for a heartbeat before the recording tore itself apart, stood the unmistakable silhouette of Dooku, elegant even in hologram blur. A voice broke through in pieces, metallic, dampened but clear enough to freeze the room. The Senate will answer to fear as it always has. A hiss of static. Tyrannous, the armies are in place. More static. The first blow must make them beg for security. The image died. No one spoke. Even 3PO, who had no instinct for silence unless it was inconvenient, made a tiny noise and went still. Obi-Wan held out his hand. R2 ejected the spindle into it. His fingers closed around the scorched metal as though it might otherwise escape. When he looked at Anakin, the familiar mildness was gone from his face. Not fear. Something colder. The expression of a man who had just watched the impossible acquire edges. Padmé was first to recover. Can that be restored? Perhaps, Obi-Wan said. Perhaps enough of it. He looked back toward the sunlight beyond the hangar. The smoke outside had thickened. Clone troopers were dragging wreckage aside to recover their dead. Somewhere in the distance, a gunship engine screamed to life. We say nothing about this here. Not to the troops. Not to anyone outside the council. Anakin stared at the blackened dish. You believe him now. Obi-Wan took too long to answer for that not to be answer enough. I believe Count Dooku wanted me to hear a lie that resembled truth, he said at last. This suggests he may not have needed to work very hard. The remark should have comforted Anakin. It did not. The voice in the recording had been wrong in a way he could not explain, like listening to something speak from behind a locked door in a room where there ought not to be a room at all. He thought of the way Dooku had fought, economical, almost sorrowful, as if the killing were a chore beneath him. He thought of Yoda facing his former student in a chamber of flame and ruined stone. He thought of the clipped words from the hologram, the Senate, fear, security. They belonged together too neatly. Padmé touched his left hand, the only hand he had now, and for one reckless instant, he nearly turned into her. Nearly buried his face against her shoulder and confessed that he was suddenly more afraid than he had been while the arena monsters bellowed and the droids ringed them with blasters. He did not. Obi-Wan was there, and the clones were there, and the war had started, and boys from nowhere were not permitted that sort of weakness. A shadow fell across the doorway. Yoda stood there, small and grave amid the wreckage, flanked by 2 clone officers who remained respectfully back. His robe hem was thick with red dust. He said nothing until Obi-Wan straightened. Leave us, Yoda told the officers. They did. His eyes moved from Obi-Wan's face to Anakin's bandaged arm, to Padmé, to the ruined transmitter, and at last to the data spindle in Obi-Wan's hand. Found something, have you? Obi-Wan gave the shortest possible account. Yoda listened without moving. Only at the words Darth Sidious did his ears alter their angle by a fraction. Difficult this is, Yoda said when Obi-Wan finished. Anakin's temper, rubbed raw by pain and humiliation, flashed. Difficult? Master, if there's a Sith directing the Separatists and hiding in the Republic, that's not difficult. That's a disaster. None. Yoda looked up at him. The old eyes held no rebuke, only a sadness that made Anakin feel younger than he wanted to be. A disaster, yes, Yoda said. And because one it is, careful we must be. Obi-Wan slipped the spindle into an inner pocket of his tunic. I agree. On Corasont, speak of this we will, Yoda said. To the council alone. Then he turned and went back into the red light, as if he had already stepped into an argument only he could hear. By the time the gunship lifted from Geonosis, the desert had become a painted map of ruin beneath them. The arena was a scar. The foundries were wounds still smoking. Clones moved in disciplined white lines through the wreckage, too small from altitude to be men and not machines. Padmé sat opposite Anakin in the troop bay, eyes closed, lips parted with exhaustion. Obi-Wan sat beside the open hatch and watched the world recede, one hand pressed against his side. R2 crouched by his boot like a loyal blue and silver hound. Anakin looked at the bandage where his arm had been, and then at his master's profile against the red sky. He understood, dimly and for the first time, that the battle they had survived might not be the battle that mattered. Somewhere behind them, in ash and broken stone, the war had left a fragment of its true face, and Obi-Wan had taken it aboard. The medbay aboard the acclimator was too clean for the kind of pain it held. White light reflected from polished floors and stainless instruments. Droids moved on whispering repulsors between beds where clone troopers lay with limbs sealed in synth skin and lungs washed pink with Bacta mist. Their numbers astonished even now. Thousands. The first army of the Republic in generations, grown in secret and delivered into history at the exact hour fear required. Anakin, drifting under the edge of anesthetic while medical droids fitted his prosthetic, thought that if the galaxy had been a story told to children, it would have sounded like a warning too obvious for anyone to ignore. Armies did not appear when they were most needed without someone having arranged the need. The mechanical hand came to him before the feeling did. He watched through a haze as articulated fingers flexed under polished casing, each joint answering the minute current from a nerve interface inset in raw flesh. His left hand lay clenched against the hospital sheet. A surgical droid told him, in a voice as courteous as it was merciless, that integration would take time. Pain would lessen. Motor response would improve. Phantom sensation was common. He wanted to ask whether phantom rage was common too. Instead, he bit down on the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood. Padmé stood behind the privacy screen once the droids permitted visitors. She had changed into fresh clothing from stores aboard ship, but exhaustion could not be changed out of. It lived in the blue shadows beneath her eyes and the drawn set of her mouth. She looked at the new hand for a long moment before looking at him. I'm sorry, she said, and because she was Padmé, it did not sound helpless. It sounded like a vow. Anakin tried for levity and found he had none. At least now Obi-Wan can stop telling me to keep a cooler head. I'm practically built for it. The joke failed between them and lay there. She stepped closer. The privacy screen and the quiet hum of the medbay made a hidden world. Outside it, clones breathed through masks and monitors chimed, and a war moved toward them across the stars. Inside it, there was only the warmth of her hand at his wrist where metal became flesh. You are alive, she said. That is not nothing. He looked at her, really looked, and felt the familiar, dangerous tenderness gather in him so swiftly it might as well have been a wound. On Naboo, he had imagined futures with her. On Tatooine, in the darker corners of himself, he had imagined taking her and running from every obligation the Jedi could name. Here in the sterile hush of the medical bay, he imagined none of that. He imagined only how fragile every promise was. "I nearly died," he said. Her mouth trembled, just once. "I know. And you nearly died. So did Obi-Wan. So did everyone." She drew a breath. "That's what frightens me, Anakin. Not that death came close. That it can be made ordinary so quickly." He wanted to tell her that the thing haunting him was not death, but the shape he had made around it in the hangar. The wild, furious boy who rushed Dooku because fear of losing Obi-Wan had gutted out everything else. He wanted to tell her he had heard himself shouting and sounded like someone older, uglier. Instead, he said, "Obi-Wan found something." Her eyes sharpened. "Why?" "I don't know all of it." That was not quite true. He knew enough to feel the edges. But whatever Dooku was talking at, it wasn't all a trick. Before she could answer, the screen whispered aside and Obi-Wan entered with Yoda and Mace Windu. Obi-Wan had bathed and changed, though his movements were still spare. One arm held carefully as if it had not forgotten Dooku's blade. Mace looked carved from the same stone as the temple itself, all hard lines and focus. Yoda climbed to the foot of the bed and stood there like a question the room had been waiting to hear. "We need the bay's secure channel," Mace said to the medical droid. "It is yours, Master Jedi," the droid replied and rolled away. Padmé gave Obi-Wan a brief look. Request, warning, solidarity all at once. He nodded, the smallest acknowledgement, and took the data spindle from his robes. A portable holoprojector was set on the table near Anakin's bed. Mace activated it. Static sprayed upward in a blue cone. Fragments jumped and failed. Then the image steadied just long enough to reveal Dooku in profile, and the cloaked figure opposite him. The figure's face remained black beneath the hood, less an absence than a pressure. The voice emerged, warped but intelligible. "The Senate will approve the deployments." A crackle. Dooku's tone, crisp and smooth. "The opposition bloc will protest, but not long. Fear has a shorter road than reason." Another burst of distortion. "When the first worlds burn, they will call this protection." The projection died. Anakin had heard it once in the hangar and still felt a shiver move under his skin, a reaction his pride disliked enough to convert at once into anger. Padmé folded her arms tightly across herself. Obi-Wan watched the dead projector as if it might continue in silence. "There is more?" Mace asked. "Not yet," Obi-Wan said. R2 preserved what he could. Temple technicians may salvage additional fragments. "Certain, this makes one thing," Yoda said. "Dooku serves another." Mace's expression did not alter, but a tautness entered the room all the same. "The question is who?" Padmé looked from one Jedi to another. "He said the Senate." "He did," Obi-Wan answered. "Dooku also lied to me in a prison cell and invited me to help him overthrow the Republic," Obi-Wan added, almost as if arguing with himself. "If he wanted suspicion turned toward the Senate, there are reasons to give him that satisfaction." Mace folded his hands behind his back. "And if he wanted to prepare us to dismiss the truth because it came from him, there are reasons for that as well." Anakin stared at the flickering afterimage still burned into his vision. "I felt something when that thing spoke." Yoda's gaze shifted to it. "What did you feel?" Anakin almost said evil and heard, even in his own mind, how adolescent the word would sound. "Not Dooku," he said instead. "He's dark, but he's still, I don't know, a man." This felt like listening to a knife. Silence answered. It was Padmé who broke it quietly. "Then perhaps we should stop hoping it belongs to no one important." Mace turned the projector off. "No one outside this room and the council is to know what was recovered on Geonosis. Not yet. If there is a hand inside the Republic guiding this war, warning it that we are looking would be worse than ignorance." "Nani? The Chancellor?" Padmé asked. "Not even him," Mace said. That startled Anakin more than the recording had. "You're not telling Chancellor Palpatine?" Mace met his gaze. If the hidden Sith has reached inside the Senate, the Chancellor's office is the first place any warning will arrive. Padmé looked at Anakin then, and in her face he saw the same disquiet opening in himself. Not because either of them believed Palpatine guilty, because the thought that he might not be safe had never before been thinkable. When the ships settled at last into the ordered traffic around Corasont, the city planet rose to meet them like a civilization determined to outshine its own corruption. From orbit it had been a web of gold and silver. From the descending transport it became towers beyond counting, platforms bright with lanes of airspeeders, bridges like ribbons of light suspended in impossible depth. Storms glimmered far below around levels no sky ever reached. The Senate district shone beneath evening like a jeweled crown. Anakin stood at the foot of the ramp with his new hand hidden in a brown glove. Padmé walked beside him in senatorial grace restored by will alone. Obi-Wan, limping only if one watched too closely, descended with Yoda and Mace toward the reception party arrayed in official rows. At its center waited Chancellor Palpatine. He stepped forward before protocol droids could announce anything, his face arranged in concern so gentle it would have seemed almost paternal had Anakin not been newly suspicious of all practiced gentleness. "My dear boy," Palpatine said, taking Anakin's left forearm in both hands. "I grieve to hear of your injury. I'll recover, Chancellor. I have no doubt of it. You are made of uncommon material." Palpatine's gaze flicked to the gloved prosthetic hand and returned, warm, approving, faintly admiring. "The Republic owes you and Master Kenobi more than words." Obi-Wan bowed. "The Republic owes the clone troopers just as much." "Indeed." Palpatine's expression deepened into public sorrow. "Their sacrifice marks the birth of a new era of defense. A necessary era, regrettably, but one history will honor." Necessary. The word scraped at Anakin. Behind the Chancellor stood Mace Windu, still and unreadable beneath the horns of his Chagrian crown, and Sly Moore with her blank, pale eyes like closed shutters. Padmé offered formal greetings. Yoda's cane tapped once against the polished landing platform. Obi-Wan, standing half a pace behind Anakin, watched the small theater with a concentration that bordered on rudeness. Palpatine noticed. For the briefest instant, so brief Anakin later wondered if it had existed at all. The Chancellor's smile altered, not fading but narrowing, as if acknowledging the presence of a second conversation. Then the moment was gone. Reporters surged. Officials advanced. Corasont opened its glittering jaws and swallowed the heroes of Geonosis into the machinery of celebration. That night, while Senate lights burned like captive constellations beyond the temple's high windows, the council was summoned in secret. The council chamber at night was a place built for truth and therefore exquisitely suited to difficult lies. The city beyond its windows flared and dimmed beneath weather and traffic, light sliding over transparent steel and moving sheets, while the seated masters seemed carved from the dark itself. Ki-Adi-Mundi's long face was grave with skepticism. Plo Koon sat as if deep currents moved beneath him where others saw stillness. CZ hands were folded, but the set of his shoulders implied battle readiness rather than contemplation. Deepa Bilaba watched with the taut calm of someone accustomed to sensing catastrophe before it arrived. Yoda stood rather than took his chair. Mace remained near the center of the room. Obi-Wan, at their request, gave his account again. He kept nothing back. Dooku's prison cell revelation. The ruined transmitter. The hologram fragment. The sense that the message had been sent in haste from Geonosis to a superior expecting progress reports rather than pleas. He ended with a sentence spoken evenly and without dramatic force, which made it land all the harder. If Count Dooku lied, he did so in a direction supported by evidence. Silence followed, not empty but busy. Each master inhabited it differently. Ki-Adi-Mundi broke first. A recorded transmission between Dooku and an unidentified cloaked figure proves only hierarchy within the Separatist command, he said. Not infiltration of the Republic. The Senate will approve the deployments, Mace replied. Those were the words. A Senate clerk could have supplied that forecast. Or a senator, Depa said quietly. Or the Chancellor himself, Sezi Tian said, blunt in the way military minds could afford to be. The room chilled. Anakin, who had not expected to be present for more than a moment, stood near Obi-Wan and tried to look as if he belonged there. He was not on the council. He was not even a knight. But Mace had sent for him explicitly, and that fact alone had set him on edge. The masters rarely brought him into discussion unless they wanted him to hear a conclusion already made. Here, their uncertainty had left a door ajar. Yoda tapped his cane against the floor once. Accusation and caution. Confuse we must not. The Chancellor, vulnerable he is, as any senator is. Proof of corruption we do not have. We have proof of a hidden Sith in league with Dooku, Mace said. That is enough to change how we fight this war. Plo Koon turned his masked face toward Anakin. Skywalker, Count Dooku fought all three of you, spoke to two. You faced him in anger. What did you sense? Anakin had expected interrogation. He had not expected respect. The question checked his first instinct, which had been to answer defensively. He looked at Obi-Wan once, found no guidance there, and spoke as precisely as he could. He wasn't surprised that Master Yoda came, Anakin said. He expected resistance. He expected the war to keep going. And when he talked about the Sith controlling the Republic, he didn't sound like he was inventing something on the spot. He groped for it. He sounded tired of being the only one in the room who knew the joke. That brought a murmur from somewhere among the seats. Not amusement, but recognition of the strange accuracy of it. Obi-Wan added, Dooku was once Yoda's student. He understands how to bait Jedi. But I agree with Anakin on this much. There was contempt in him, not improvisation. Nun. Ki-Adi-Mundi's brow furrowed. Contempt is not evidence. No, Mace said. But arrogance often produces it. The argument ranged for more than an hour. Whether to inform the Senate of a Sith threat in abstract terms, whether to widen surveillance of the Finance Committee, appropriations, military procurement, old corporate allies of the Trade Federation, whether to re-examine the clone army's origin in light of Ducas alias Tyrannus. That last question changed the room. Obi-Wan recounted Kamino again, Jango Fett's admission that he had been recruited by a man called Tyrannus. A line connected. Not perfectly. Enough. When at last the council dismissed all but Mace, Yoda, and Obi-Wan, Anakin remained where he was until Mace looked at him. You have leave for recovery, Mace said. Anakin almost smiled at the wording. Recovery suggested peace, and peace had died somewhere over Geonosis. Yes, Master. Mace's gaze dropped to the gloved hand and rose again. Do not mistake injury for failure. The sentence was so unlike anything Anakin had ever expected from him that for a second he did not know what to do with it. I won't, he said, which was not entirely true. Obi-Wan walked with him to the lift. The temple after midnight was hushed, all the great public corridors reduced to echoes and distant light. He meant it, Obi-Wan said. Who? Mace. Anakin leaned back against the lift wall. That's almost more unsettling than Dooku. Obi-Wan's mouth twitched. It is a week for new experiences. A week later on Naboo, the lake lay so still at dusk it held the sky without breaking it. There were places in the galaxy where war seemed incapable of entry, where every leaf and stone was composed with such serene confidence that violence looked like a rumor. The retreat in the lake country was one of them. Marble colonnades rose from gardens, breathing jasmine and night water. Lanterns floated among reeds. Beyond the terrace, the broad black mirror of the water turned the first stars into a second heaven beneath the first. Anakin stood in dark formal wear that could not disguise how young he was, or how badly he wanted the impossible. Padmé stood before him in white, the light catching on the fabric so that she seemed less dressed than veiled in brightness. A handful of trusted household retainers had arranged the private ceremony and then discreetly vanished. Only the old Naboo holy man remained, and R2 and 3PO. and the sounds of the garden. He had come to Naboo on medical leave. Officially. Unofficially, there had never been another place he could have gone. Geonosis had ripped the future open and shown him its bones. Every certainty he had held since boyhood, Jedi duty, Republic endurance, the linear logic that good intentions became good outcomes if one only tried hard enough, had taken a blow there. The only truth that had not wavered was the one standing before him. "I cannot offer safety," he said, and his own voice shook him. Not because it trembled, but because it did not. Not honestly. "I can't promise I will never be called away. I can't promise the Order won't ask things of me that seem impossible. I can't promise this war will not try to take everything it can reach." Padmé's eyes did not leave his. "Then offer what is yours to offer." He drew breath. The lake smelled of clean water and stone cooled after sun. "Somewhere far off a bird," cried once, and fell silent. "I offer that there is no version of my life in which I stop coming back to you," he said. "Even if I am foolish, even if I am afraid, even if I have to walk through everything I hate to do it." Her face changed then, not with tears exactly, but with the release of some held thing. "And I offer that I will not ask you to become less than you are, so that I can be more comfortable," she said. "I will not turn away when you are difficult. I will not love some safer imaginary man instead of you." The old holy man spoke the traditional words. They repeated them. Rings passed. The knight took their vows and kept them without witnesses that mattered to the Republic or the Order or the galaxy at large. When it was over and the old man had withdrawn, they stood alone beneath the colonnade while moonlight whitened the terrace stones. Padmé leaned her head against Anakin's shoulder and exhaled as if she had reached a shore she'd been swimming toward in darkness. He touched her cheek with his new hand, careful, astonished that metal could perform tenderness if the will behind it was gentle enough. "Does it feel strange?" she asked softly. "The hand? The marriage?" He looked at the ring against her skin and smiled for the first time since Geonosis without forcing it. "No," he said. "Everything else does." When he returned to Corasont 3 days later, he returned with a secret on one hand and a wedding ring hidden beneath his glove on the other. Obi-Wan met him in the temple hangar. His eyes went at once to Anakin's face and lingered there with an unreadable expression. "You look rested," Obi-Wan said. "I was. That is almost suspicious enough to report." Anakin's heartbeat stumbled. For one impossible instant he thought Obi-Wan somehow knew everything. But the older man only turned toward the temple interior and added, "Enjoy the sensation. Mace wants us in the archives." "No." The door had stayed ajar. The war, it seemed, would not wait for men to decide whether they were ready to live 2 lives at once. Sereno wore its age like inheritance and accusation both. The mountain citadel of House Dooku stood under a sky the color of old pewter, its towers rising from dark forests and terraced vineyards that had outlived republics, kings, and philosophies. Rain moved over distant hills and curtains. Inside the ancestral halls, servants crossed polished stone with eyes lowered and steps noiseless from generations of training. Portraits of dead nobles looked down from paneled walls, men and women of exacting beauty whose mouths all seemed on the verge of disapproval. Count Dooku dismissed the last of his attendants shortly before midnight and went alone to the western balcony outside his private study. The air smelled of wet cedar and distant lightning. He set a single candle on the balustrade and activated the encrypted holocommunicator embedded beneath a carved gargoyle head. Blue static rose. A hooded figure resolved within it, taller than the flame, robe edges ragged with distortion. "My master," Dooku said, bowing his head just enough. The figure's voice came through the weather-muted air like oil poured over steel. "The war begins as expected." Dooku let the candlelight move over his face and hide what it would. Geonosis served its purpose. The Republic has accepted the clone army without debate. Emergency powers have metastasized into custom. The Jedi led troops. Good. There was, Dooku reflected not for the first time, nothing in Sidious's tone that resembled satisfaction as ordinary beings knew it. The Sith Lord treated triumph as clerical confirmation. Good meant the universe had obeyed a line already written. The losses among the foundries were heavier than projected, Dooku continued. Poggle was taken alive. Several regional commanders were destroyed. Replace them. The Jedi recovered parts of a communications alcove before the demolition charges consumed the room. That drew stillness, and stillness from Sidious was always more dangerous than anger. The blue image did not move, yet the night on Sereno seemed to contract around the balcony. What parts? A transmitter dish, mostly useless. A damaged data spindle. I ordered the chamber purged before departure. A lie, elegant for its incompleteness. Dooku had indeed ordered the chamber purged. He had not stayed to confirm its success. The omission had been unavoidable once Yoda entered the duel. It became choice only afterward, in retrospect, when one decided whether to confess imprecision to a master who interpreted imprecision as betrayal. Sidious's hood turned slightly, as if he could see through the static into the line of Dooku's pulse. Can the recording be restored? I judged it unlikely. And what did you tell Kenobi? Rain touched the balcony stones. Dooku kept his hands folded behind his back. I told him a truth so implausible he would hesitate to accept it. That there is a Sith above me. That influence runs through the Republic. Gurney. Why? Because he's intelligent enough to mistrust gifts. He would question why I revealed it. That question will entangle him more effectively than denial. A pause. Then, softly, perhaps. Dooku knew that tone well. It meant Sidious had not decided whether to kill him. The larger strategy remains intact, he said. The Jedi are now generals instead of sages. The Senate calls fear discipline. Corporate alliances cling to the Confederacy because their profits require instability. The war will season them all. None. Ki. Atkai. The war, Sidious said, will ripen the galaxy for rule. There it was. Not reform. Not purification. Not even the brutal utilitarian peace Dooku had once allowed himself to imagine when he first turned from the Order's pious hypocrisies. Rule. Naked, simple, permanent. Sidious had always intended it, of course. Dooku was neither fool nor innocent. Yet every so often the word emerged without adornment and reminded him that he served not a surgeon of corruption, but a connoisseur of power. When next I speak, Sidious said, I expect reports on Kaminoan compliance, the banking reallocations, and the first offensives in the mid-rim. Delay is useful only when chosen. The transmission ended. Dooku stood on the balcony with the candle guttering beside him and listened to thunder pass over the valley. Below, the forests of Sereno breathed in black waves. Beyond them lay estates and villages whose tenants still invoked the Dooku name with reverence, though the Republic had long since reduced such feudal loyalties to quaint local color. He remembered the day he had left the Order, the clean, savage relief of choosing disillusionment over hypocrisy. He remembered Yoda's disappointment, concealed and therefore all the heavier. He remembered Qui-Gon Jinn's searching questions as a young man, the way he had looked at the machinery of the Republic and seen cogs where others saw inevitabilities. He had joined Sidious because the Republic was rotten, because the Senate drowned principle and procedure, because the Jedi had yoked their spiritual obligations to bureaucrats, and then called the harness virtue. All of that remained true. The Trade Federation was corrupt. The courts were toothless. The outer systems bled while the core debated tariffs in decorative language. Dooku had not been wrong to despise it. But there was a difference between despising corruption and worshipping domination, and lately he had begun to suspect he was not standing where he had thought. Inside, in a drawer lined with black velvet, lay the signet of House Dooku, which he had not worn publicly since his departure from the Jedi. He went to it now, opened the drawer, and lifted the ring. The metal was heavy, old, engraved with a crest older than the Republic. Aristocracy was a foolish thing in many ways, but it had at least one honest advantage: it understood inheritance. It understood what kinds of power devoured the line that fed them. Sidious would discard him if the design required it. He knew this as surely as he knew the patterns of rain against the balcony rail. The younger man, Anakin Skywalker, had fury in him, force, recklessness, raw capacity. Dooku had seen it in the duel. Sidious would have seen it too. A weapon that powerful was never left lying unused. Dooku slid the ring onto his finger and returned to the balcony. Far below, lightning unveiled the valley and hid it again. He had lied to his master tonight. It was a small thing. Barely a bend in the vast architecture of betrayal that supported them both. Small things, he thought, were how collapse began. He pinched out the candle flame between gloved fingers and stood in darkness long enough to feel the rain reach him. The archives smelled of paper that should not have existed. Somewhere beneath the cold, clean tang of data circuits and climate control, there lingered the dry vegetal breath of bound volumes, preserved because the Jedi valued the continuity of touch almost as much as the continuity of information. Jocasta knew moved among the shelves with proprietary authority, one thin hand gliding along spines, while the other summoned holoscreens from hidden projectors. If the temple itself had ever chosen a human voice, Obi-Wan thought, it might have chosen hers, patient, exact, faintly disapproving of the living for the inconvenience they posed to order. Master Sidious requested no access logs in person because none would have seemed suspicious at the time, she said, calling up decade-old records. He was still on the council when the initial inquiries regarding Kamino and genetic capacity were made. And he was dead before the army was delivered, Obi-Wan said. Correct. Anakin leaned over the console, glove removed now that the initial swelling had eased, and the prosthetic no longer drew staring pity from everyone who noticed it. The metal fingers rested on the edge of the table with deceptive delicacy. Then who kept the contract going? Jocasta's mouth thinned, which in her case amounted to fury. That is the very question, young Skywalker, and one the records seem peculiarly shy about answering. Shakti stood opposite them, crimson skin luminous in the archive light. She had spent the previous days between Corasont and Kamino, helping oversee the integration of the clone forces with military command. Weariness lived in the careful economy of her motions. The Kaminoans insist the donor agreements and growth acceleration schedules were amended under legitimate authorization, she said. All signatures route back to approved channels. All approvals are properly sealed. None of the names attached exist in any chain we can verify. Manufactured bureaucracy, Obi-Wan murmured. Or bureaucracy made useful, Shakti replied. The holo changed. Kaminoan schematics rose blue and translucent above the table. Embryos in suspended chambers, growth cylinders ranked by the 1,000 neural conditioning diagrams, and medical annotations too dense for a glance to decipher. Rain hissed through the recorded feed, the endless weather of Kamino rendered in silent light. Obi-Wan felt again the dislocation he had experienced there, the sense of stepping into a secret so large it ought to have cast a shadow visible from orbit. Jocasta expanded a medical subfile. Behavioral adaptation packages, she said. Obedience, tactical processing, group cohesion, stress threshold regulation. Anakin made a face. You mean training? Among other things. Obi-Wan studied the notation. Some elements were straightforward enough. Accelerated developmental imprinting. Reflex tuning. Hormonal modulation to reduce impulsive insubordination. Military engineering. Morally unpleasant but unsurprising. Other lines were sealed behind Kamino's syntax custom-built to discourage outside interpretation. He pointed. That category. Shakti glanced over. Contingency architecture. For what contingency? The Togruta master's expression tightened. The Kaminoans call it internal control integrity. They say the clones are too valuable to leave vulnerable to broad-spectrum neurological collapse during rapid growth. Stabilization chips. Inhibitors, correctives. Anakin straightened. Chips? Shakti met his gaze. Medical implants. Before you decide to be outraged, Remember that these men were designed as soldiers from the beginning. Their biology is already an argument. The answer settled badly in Obi-Wan. Not because he had never considered the possibility of implanted controls. Kamino did nothing by halves. But because the phrase internal control integrity fit too neatly beside the rest of what they had learned. A hidden army. A dead Jedi's name. Tyrannus. Dooku. Datu. A secret Sith. He watched blue Kaminoan rain fall forever through the hollow and thought, not for the last time, that evil most often entered the world on paperwork. After the archive session, he found Anakin in a private training cell, stripped to tunic and trousers, driving a remote into the floor with such violence the little machine rebounded smoking. The room smelled of ozone and sweat. Another remote circled at shoulder height, firing low power stings. Anakin deflected with a blur of blue light and a metal hand that had already learned its work too well. "You'll frighten the walls," Obi-Wan said from the doorway. Anakin cut down the second remote. It fell in two neat pieces. "They should be frightened." Obi-Wan came in. "The walls are innocent. Then they have a luxury I don't." The answer was too quick to be casual. Obi-Wan waited. This was new between them. This waiting. Before Geonosis he would have corrected at once, smoothed with doctrine, quoted some temple maxim about serenity until Anakin bristled himself into silence. Geonosis had stripped certain habits down to the grain. If Dooku had taught him anything beyond humility, it was that boys who nearly died for you should not always be handled like pupils reciting. Anakin deactivated his lightsaber and paced once, restless as a caged Nexu. "I lost because I was angry. I know that. Everyone thinks it. You don't have to say it. I wasn't going to." That stopped him. "You weren't?" Obi-Wan leaned against the wall, arms folded. "You lost because Dooku is one of the greatest duelists of our era, because you were still injured from the arena, because you charged him in a room full of smoke while terrified for me, and because you are 20 and he is 80 with a lifetime of discipline behind his blade. Anger contributed. It was not the whole poem." Something in Anakin's face loosened and then fought to tighten again. "You make it sound less humiliating than it was. I am very gifted that way." The ghost of a smile flickered and vanished. Anakin looked down at his prosthetic hand. "Do you think the council blames me?" Obi-Wan considered lying and chose not to. "Some of them worry about you. That is not the same." "It feels like the same." "I know." Obi-Wan exhaled. "When I was your age, I mistook half the council's concern for condemnation. The difference often reveals itself only in retrospect." Anakin glanced up sharply. "You?" Obi-Wan smiled without mirth. "Contrary to temple myth, I was not born reasonable. I was merely broken impatiently." He stepped closer and, surprising himself as much as Anakin, said, "After Maul killed Qui-Gon, there were days I wanted revenge more than justice. I wanted it enough that I could taste it. If I had found him alive immediately after Naboo, I do not know that I would have been wise." Anakin stared. Obi-Wan had almost never spoken of those days, except in the most formal terms, as if grief were a garment one wore privately and never named in public. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you think your anger makes you singular, and it does not. It makes you dangerous when unexamined, but not singular." The room was quiet except for the faint hum of damaged remotes cooling on the floor. At length Anakin said, "When Dooku had you down, I thought—" He stopped. "That I was about to die," Obi-Wan supplied gently. Anakin nodded once. "And what frightened you more than that?" The younger man's jaw worked. The answer, when it came, was almost inaudible. "That I couldn't stop it." Obi-Wan let the truth hang there. Failure. Helplessness. The old wound under all the new ones. He knew then, perhaps for the first time fully, that if anyone ever learned to press hard enough on that fear, Anakin would burn the world to make it stop. "Then we learn," Obi-Wan said, "how not to be made helpless by our terror." Later that evening, after they had taken tea in silence that was no longer hostile, a call came from Shock T on secure channel. Kamino had forwarded a fragmentary administrative route linked to the original funding of the clone contracts. Not enough to reveal the sponsor. Enough to show the money had moved through a shell lattice nested inside Senate appropriations and wartime discretionary accounts. Anakin looked from the hollow to Obi-Wan. So Dooku was telling the truth. Not all of it, Obi-Wan said. Never all of it. He thought of Mace, of Yoda, of the Chancellor greeting them on the landing platform with benevolent gravity. But perhaps enough to matter. The city outside the training cell windows glimmered like circuitry. Somewhere in that brilliance, hidden beneath office seals and public speeches, the war had written its own signature. The Senate pretended emergencies were temporary by dressing them in process. Padmé had learned that within days of returning to Corasont, motions were filed. Votes were scheduled. Committees were announced with such solemn regularity that one might almost forget each formality ratified a transfer of power from deliberation to fear. The Military Creation Act was no longer a controversy. It had become fact. Emergency powers, granted with rhetoric about duration and necessity, now stretched their roots into every question of procurement, deployment, intelligence sharing, and fiscal discretion. The rot of it was not that many senators supported the measures in bad faith. Most supported them because they were afraid, and because fear rewarded any voice that sounded certain. She stood one evening beneath the vaulted bronze ribs of a Senate corridor while session bells tolled, and watched clusters of senators break apart like schools of fish. Bail Organa emerged from a side chamber, robes dark, expression pinched by frustration. "They've moved the oversight language to subcommittee," he said without preamble. Padmé fell into step beside him. "Which means it disappears." "Not disappears. Matures invisibly into something we cannot reverse." His dry bitterness would have amused her on another day. Tonight, it only confirmed her own. Bail was one of the few people in the Senate whose conscience had not yet learned to bargain with expedience. Mon Mothma joined them from another passage, younger than the gravity she already carried, her features composed in that disciplined way of politicians who were born understanding that feeling must be filtered before use. "The Chancellor's office is routing military emergency requests through supplemental channels now," Mon said quietly. "Not illegal, technically, merely insulated." "From scrutiny," Padmé said. "From delay," Bail corrected, and they all understood the official wording he had not chosen. It was Mon who noticed the aide first, a human man in mid-level administrative gray, hovering near a pillar with the haunted look of someone deciding whether to ruin his own life. When Padmé's gaze met his, he flinched and then crossed to them with forced casualness. "Senator Amidala," he said, bowing too quickly. "A word?" Bail and Mon did not move away. The aides swallowed. Privately, if possible. Padmé read terror and urgency in equal parts. "Walk with us," she said. He did, shoulders tight. They descended a lesser-used stair instead of taking the crowded lift shafts. Traffic noise rose faintly through the structure, the endless pulse of Corasont beyond ceremony. On the second landing, he stopped and produced a slim data crystal from his sleeve. "I processed discretionary transfers for the Wartime Relief Office," he said. "Or I did. I found duplicate authorization streams attached to emergency distribution funds. The signatures are valid, but the accounts they feed are shell entities routed through corporate alliance proxies and Outer Rim customs trusts. Some of them vanish into Confederacy space." Bail's face went still. Mon's eyes sharpened. Padmé kept her voice level. "Why bring this to me?" The man laughed once, soundless and broken. "Because I sent a question up the chain and received a response from an office 3 levels above where it should have gone. Because yesterday 2 Coruscant Guard officers visited my desk and advised me not to concern myself with matters already under executive review. Because my wife asked why I was looking over my shoulder at dinner and I lied to her badly." He pressed the crystal into Padmé's hand. It was warm from his skin. "If I take this, I can't protect you," she said. "I know. Do you have copies?" "Not anymore." Mon looked ready to scold him for that. Bail looked ready to ask a dozen questions at once. Padmé asked only one. Who authorized the upper response? The aide's mouth went dry. The routing key traced back to an executive discretionary cluster. I couldn't see the originating terminal, only the SEAL family. He looked at each of them and seemed to age several years in the stairwell's low light. It's from the Chancellor's side. No one spoke for a heartbeat. The aide straightened, as if by doing so he could reclaim an ordinary posture in an extraordinary moment. I have to go home, he said. If I don't, my wife will know something's wrong. Padmé wanted to order him into protective custody, but senators did not command such things cleanly and openly. Not without broadcasting why. Bail began. At least let me. The man was already backing away. No attention, he said. That's the point. He left by the service corridor and was gone. By the time Padmé returned to her apartment tower, the crystal felt like a live charge in her palm. She ordered all domestic staff to retire, deactivated the visible recording systems, and stood alone in her sitting room with the traffic lights of Corasont sliding across the windows. The apartment, usually a sanctuary of Naboo restraint translated into metropolitan elegance, looked suddenly theatrical. Too many polished surfaces, too many places where a hidden eye might admire its own cleverness. She opened the crystal on a private terminal. Streams of transfers bloomed, nested and cross-nested, tagged to relief, munitions reserve, refugee redistribution, clone logistics, back to relief again. Most were exactly the kind of bureaucratic maze designed to bore honest people into surrender. But several paths did precisely what the aide had claimed. They left the Republic's emergency accounts and entered a network of corporate fronts with ties to systems now openly aligned with the Confederacy. It should not have been possible. It should have been nonsense. It was too large for mere graft, too purposeful for accidental overlap. And at the root of the authorization tree, masked behind executive seals, lay a root that touched the Chancellor's discretionary cluster. Padmé sat back from the screen and felt cold despite the warm apartment air. Palpatine had been her ally for years. Not intimate, never that he had always been too skilled at intimacy to invite full trust. But steady, helpful, seemingly sincere in his concern for Naboo and for her. He had praised her courage when others called it obstinacy. He had advanced with the support of the world they shared. To think his office might be contaminated by something as monstrous as what Dooku implied was to think a familiar room had grown teeth. She knew who should see the crystal first. She also knew what bringing it to a Jedi would mean. It would move the suspicion out of politics and into a far more dangerous realm. Yet she remembered Obi-Wan's face when he spoke of the Geonosis recording. She remembered Anakin saying it was not all a trick. She contacted Obi-Wan on the secure temple frequency and asked, with careful casualness, whether he might visit regarding a matter of senatorial concern. He came himself, not by holo, arriving through a private hangar entrance less than an hour later. He wore simple robes and the expression of a man who had expected bad news and disliked being proved right. She led him to the inner study without ceremony and activated the room's isolation field. "Anakin?" he asked first. The question was so immediate, so revealing of his own priorities, that she nearly smiled. "He's well." "Good." Obi-Wan let out a breath. "Then what is it?" She handed him the crystal. He read faster than most politicians and with less vanity about understanding what he did not yet understand. Twice, he asked brief, clarifying questions. 3 times his face changed, not dramatically but enough. At the mention of the executive routing family, he went very still. "This came from where?" he asked. She told him about the aide. "And now?" He went home. Obi-Wan closed his eyes once, as if in pain. "I hope he did." The words chilled her. "You think he's in danger?" "I think anyone who noticed this is in danger." He looked up at the windows, at the city. For one unstable second, Padmé had the absurd impression he was trying to see all of Coruscant at once. Every office, every corridor, every hidden relay. "I need to take this to Mace and Yoda." That's why I called you. And you were right to." His tone softened. "Padmé, if this touches the Chancellor's office even indirectly, the line between government and battlefront has already been crossed. You understand what follows if the Council moves on suspicion and not proof." "I do." He searched her face, perhaps weighing whether she truly did. Perhaps seeing there something of the same resolve that had made him trust her on Naboo years before. "Anakin must not know where this came from yet," he said. A pulse of annoyance went through her. "He's not a child." "No," Obi-Wan said, and the answer held more meaning than the words themselves. "Which is why I'm asking." Before she could press him, the entry chimes sounded. Both of them turned. Padmé's heart kicked once. No one should be here. She moved first, Obi-Wan behind her, silent as weather. The outer door opened to reveal Captain Typho, rigid with controlled alarm. "Milady," he said, "forgive the hour. There's been an incident." The frightened aide from the stairwell had been found dead in a lower traffic lane collision. "Vehicle malfunction," local security said. "Speed loss. Fire. No survivors." After Typho withdrew, the apartment seemed to contract around its own silence. Padmé stared at the closed door. Obi-Wan's face had become unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said. She laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was to break something. "He was right," she said. "We're already too late." Obi-Wan put the crystal inside his robes with a care that felt ritualistic. "No," he said quietly. "Not if we stop being polite about what this means." Palpatine received the Senate's applause that morning as though it belonged to history rather than to him. Relief appropriations passed. Wartime logistics were expedited. A committee was formed to investigate profiteering in military contracts, which in practice meant 3 men favorable to the Chancellor would spend 2 months drafting language nobody intended to enforce. He thanked the chamber for its trust with that measured humility which implied not self-effacement but service too grave for vanity. From the guest tiers the public saw what it wanted: steadiness in danger, a leader equal to the moment. Only those who had studied him for years could detect the minute signs of strain, and even then, only if they knew where to look. The half beat too long before he rose after the vote. The way one hand rested on the arm of the Chancellor's pod with pressure not quite concealed. The infinitesimal sharpening around the eyes when Mon Mothma asked in decorous terms why executive discretionary routes had expanded without notice to the full oversight block. It was not accusation. It was a fishing line. Palpatine smiled and answered with sufficient detail to reassure fools and sufficient vagueness to frustrate the rest. Yet beneath the measured cadence of his response ran a current of calculation already moving ahead to consequence. Someone had found something. Not enough to expose him clearly, or the question would have been different. Enough to embolden inquiry. Back in his office, with the ceremonial aides dismissed and the doors sealed, he let the public mask loosen by degrees, rather than break. Sly Moore stood near the windows, pale profile cut against daylight. Mace Windu remained by the central desk, massive hands folded. "The senator from Chandrila has sharpened sooner than expected," Palpatine said. Mace Windu inclined his head. "She has company." "Of course she does. Idealists cluster when frightened. It gives them the illusion of relevance." Sly Moore's voice was soft as poured milk. "There was an accident in under traffic last night, one administrative clerk tied to emergency routing inquiries. Was he carrying anything? We are still determining whether he had already passed materials to a second party." Palpatine's irritation stirred. Not fury. Fury was wasteful, but a narrow, hard impatience. Dooku had reported Geonosis contained. The Jedi should still be busy translating battlefield confusion into military duty. Instead, Mace Windu had requested sealed archive access to Kamino contract histories, and Obi-Wan Kenobi had spent the better part of the night inside Senator Amidala's tower. Kenobi. Interesting. The man had always been more perceptive than most who cloaked themselves in modesty. "Continue pressure within the Senate," Palpatine said. Quietly. "I want the oversight questions divided between those who suspect corruption and those who suspect mere incompetence." Let them quarrel over whether the rod is ordinary. None. Da. Mace Windu bowed. Sly Moore did not move, but assent from her never required motion. Far below the luminous levels of executive power, Corasont descended into older skeletons. The works district predated much of the city's current architecture, a labyrinth of abandoned manufactories, half-sealed shafts, derelict transit tubes, forgotten furnaces, and industrial substructures left in place because dismantling them cost more than building above them. It was a region of rust and echoes, home to scavengers, hidden workshops, illicit data dens, and secrets that preferred the smell of lubricant to the smell of marble. Mace led the descent with the brisk authority of a soldier who distrusted subterranean places on principle. Obi-Wan followed, a hooded shape among shadows, while Yoda rode a small repulsor platform only where the terrain required and otherwise kept pace with cane and stubbornness. 2 temple technicians had traced the Geonosis transmission shard through ancient relay architecture. Padmé's crystal had provided routing families. Together, the map narrowed to a dead patch in the works where executive-grade encryption had no business brushing against separatist dark frequencies. This would be simpler if our enemies had the decency to build obvious fortresses, Obi-Wan murmured. Mace gave him a side glance. You'd complain they were trying too hard. That would not make them less inconsiderate. Their banter sat thin over tension, but Yoda's ears twitched in what might almost have been approval. He disliked despair, Obi-Wan had noticed. He considered it a vanity in most cases. The first relay station they found had been stripped months ago, perhaps years. The second contained nothing but nests of wire scavenged for resale. The third was hidden behind a welded false wall and reeked of recent ozone. Inside, amid dust disturbed within the last day, lay the husks of 2 security droids and a portable transmitter rig burned out from the inside. Mace knelt beside the rig. Self-purge. Obi-Wan crouched at the opposite side. And hurried. The phrase returned from Geonosis like an old note in a song. He examined the blast scoring. Same haste. Same incomplete certainty. Whoever cleaned these sites believed in destruction more than verification. Yoda closed his eyes. The dim chamber, lit only by their lamps and the occasional red pulse from half-dead equipment, made his small figure seem carved from the dark. When he opened them again, there was no triumph in his expression, only confirmation. Been here, the shadow has. Obi-Wan felt it too now that he had stopped looking only with his eyes. The residue was faint under layers of heat and metal, but unmistakable. A pressure in the Force like old poison, disciplined and withheld. Not Dooku's refined severity. Something colder, almost intimate in its malice. A sound clanged in the tunnel beyond. All 3 Jedi rose as one. The attack came in silence first. 2 droidicas rolling fast from intersecting corridors, shields flaring blue, followed by a spray of blaster fire from humanoid shapes deeper in the dark. Mace's lightsaber ignited in a violet sheet and turned the chamber into a sudden furnace of color. Obi-Wan's blue answered it. Yoda's green seemed less to appear than to cut itself out of the air. The fight was brief and violent. Droidicas died in showers of sparks. The humanoid shooters proved to be armored industrial droids retrofitted for security, their aim competent but mechanical. Obi-Wan cut through one at the waist, spun, deflected a bolt into a second's photoreceptor, and thought with detached annoyance that even sabotage had grown impersonal. Mace advanced through blaster fire as if it were weather. Yoda vanished beneath a stream of red and reappeared on a pipe above it, severing a power feed with one tiny motion that dropped the last droid twitching in darkness. Afterward, only the hot stink of ruptured circuitry remained. These weren't placed to stop us, Mace said, deactivating his blade. They were placed to delay us. Then we are already late, Obi-Wan said. He searched the chamber while Mace scanned the tunnel network for living signals. In the back wall, behind a stack of corroded casings, he found a shallow compartment containing a hardened memory wafer. Not Geonosian. Republic manufacture. Executive grade. He held it up. Not late enough. Temple technicians worked on the wafer through the night. By dawn, they had extracted only fragments, but the fragments mattered. Relay handshakes between dead nodes. A masked channel identifier known to exist only in high-level government communications. A timestamp cross-matched within minutes of the Geonosis transmission burst. And one partial visual frame, too damaged to show a face, yet sufficient to display the edge of a hood and the reflected curve of what looked like a high office window behind it. Mace studied the image in silence. "Could be any executive suite," Obi-Wan said. "Could," Mace agreed. Yoda stood at the projector's edge, watching the damaged blue light quiver. "Closer. The circle grows." Not close enough, Obi-Wan thought, but perhaps close enough to make the hidden hand feel watched. He did not know, could not know, that at that same hour Palpatine stood before his own office windows, with one hand resting lightly against the glass, looking down toward the levels where the works decayed beneath the city. He looked serene. Only the pressure marks his fingertips left on the transparent steel betrayed the violence of his thought. The trail from Jango Fett led downward as most corrupt trails on Corasont did. Above a certain level, corruption took the form of speeches, contracts, and polished offices. Below it, corruption remembered its body. It sweated. It bled. It passed cash in alleys and names through teeth missing from old fights. Obi-Wan had expected no less from a line that began with a dead bounty hunter hired by a man calling himself Tyrannus. Anakin met him at dusk in civilian clothes and a cloak too plain for his natural flair, which meant he was taking the mission seriously enough not to enjoy the disguise. "Mace approved this?" he asked as they descended from the transport platform into a district where the overhead sky had long since become layers of traffic lanes and corroded support struts. "Mace approved me," Obi-Wan said. "And me?" Obi-Wan let the question hang a beat. "Mace approved my judgment." Anakin huffed. "That's almost insulting enough to be honest." "It is exactly that." Their contact had once run weapons and forged transponder identities for hunters operating near the moons of Bogdan, where, according to Jango Fett, Tyrannus had first approached him. The man now called himself Virlo, and owned a tavern that sold fermented fungus spirits to mechanics, slicers, dock enforcers, and beings no sane person would have trusted with a menu. The place smelled of coolant, old spice, wet fabric, and frying protein of uncertain origin. Music thudded somewhere behind the bar with all the subtlety of a cardiac event. Virlo recognized Jedi trouble the moment they entered. His expression collapsed inward like paper near flame. He was small, gray-skinned, and heavily scarred, with one eye replaced by a cheap mechanical prosthetic that whirred faintly when he lied, which, Obi-Wan discovered, was often. "We're not here to arrest you," Obi-Wan said, which was useful only because it happened to be true. Virlo gave a jerky laugh. "You say that like it helps." "We're looking for information about a man called Tyrannus," Anakin said. The mechanical eye spun so fast it clicked. "Never heard it." Obi-Wan laid a chit of Republic credit on the table and another on top of it. "You have now." The fixer stared at the money with the complex sorrow of a man who knew exactly how expensive speech could become. "I heard the name once," he muttered. "Long time back. Human. Rich voice. Didn't come himself most days. Sent others. Paid for introductions, DNA screens, false itineraries, sealed hangars, high-grade work." "On Bogdan," Obi-Wan said. Virlo nodded. "One of the moons, yes." "For Jango Fett?" The fixer's good eye narrowed. "Maybe." Anakin leaned in. "We found Fett. He's dead." "Nani? Geonosis? I... Then whatever loyalty you were selling died with him." That struck home. Virlo looked down into his cup. "Tyrannus didn't belong down here," he said after a moment. "That's what I remember. People try to hide class, but it clings. He had it. Not just money, breeding. The kind that expects doors to open and is irritated by the physics when they don't." "Dooku," Anakin said. Obi-Wan lifted a hand a fraction, enough to quiet him. "Did you ever see Tyrannus with anyone?" Virlo hesitated too long. Anyone, Obi-Wan repeated. Who frightened you more than he did? The mechanical eye clicked. Sometimes, Virlo whispered. There were messages, not people, channels, executive encryption families. The kind no hunter should ever see unless he'd made the wrong kind of enemy. Tyrannus would arrive angry from those messages and leave, colder. Anakin's breathing changed. Obi-Wan heard it and disliked the sound. Whose encryption? Obi-Wan asked. I don't know. The fixer spread his hands. I'm not a senator. Did the signals identify sector? Upper levels? Government spines? That's all. No, he was still holding something back. Obi-Wan felt it like a knot in the room. Virlo, totemed. The fixer looked at him and found, perhaps unexpectedly, no menace there. Obi-Wan had learned long ago that some men lied less to compassion than to fear. Listen to me, he said. A war is burning across the galaxy because of hidden arrangements like the ones you facilitated. If there is more, and you keep it, people will die for your silence who never knew your name. Help us now, and perhaps that becomes lighter. Virlo laughed bitterly. Nothing becomes lighter. No, Obi-Wan said. But it becomes ours to carry with you. Something in that absurdly did what money and intimidation had not. Virlo reached beneath the table and produced a data sliver no larger than a fingernail. I kept this because it scared me too much to destroy, he said. Timestamp only, no content. A handshake between Tyrannus's courier frequency and a masked executive line. I told myself it was insurance. Then I told myself it was suicide. Couldn't decide. Anakin snatched the sliver. You should have brought this to the Senate. Virlo barked a laugh. And told them what? That they're respectable men buy hunters in dirty rooms? Nay. The tavern door burst inward. 3 gunmen opened fire from the threshold without warning. Not bounty hunters, Obi-Wan thought instantly. Too disciplined in formation, too willing to shoot through civilians. Corporate security or something adjacent. He shoved the table into Virlo, sending the fixer under cover, while blue light flared in his hand. Anakin's blade came alive a heartbeat later, bright enough to turn spilled drinks into rubies. The room became chaos. Patrons screamed and dropped. Bolts struck bottles into showers of acid liquor. 1 gunman died before his second shot, Anakin crossing the distance in a slash of speed and fury. Obi-Wan deflected the next barrage toward the ceiling pipes. Steam blew down. Through it he saw the 3rd attacker fleeing and shouted, "Alive if possible!" Anakin gave chase over the overturned tables and through the side passage. Obi-Wan followed, cursing under his breath and over it. They hit the alley bridge outside in time to find the gunman sprawled against the rail, throat held under Anakin's metal hand while the young Jedi's lightsaber hummed a handspan from his face. "Who sent you?" Anakin demanded. The man, helmet cracked, coughed blood and laughed. Too late. Anakin shoved harder. The rail groaned. Below, lower levels yawned away into industrial dark and traffic haze. Who? Obi-Wan seized his shoulder. Anakin. He knows. I know he does. Release him. The younger man's whole body had become a single line pulled past its tolerance. Obi-Wan felt rage in him like heat from a furnace door. Not because of the attack alone. Because the pattern was too familiar now. Clues, then bodies. Dooku's shadow behind all of it. Power using secrecy as a weapon and leaving ordinary people broken in its wake. Helplessness translated into violence at the nearest available target. Anakin? Obi-Wan said again, lower. For a long second he thought he might fail. Then the grip loosened a fraction. The gunman coughed and spat scarlet over the rail. You're fools, he rasped. You think he sits in some cave on some dead moon. He walks above you every day. Closer to the Senate than the Jedi dream. None. Way. He bit down. Obi-Wan lunged. Too late. A poison capsule cracked between the man's teeth. Foam streaked his lips. He convulsed once and sagged. Anakin released him as if burned. The corpse collapsed to the wet metal decking. Steam drifted around them. Far below, traffic thundered like distant surf. Obi-Wan deactivated his blade and looked at his former apprentice in the glistening alley light. "You were going to kill him." Anakin stared at the dead man. Maybe. Would it have helped? No. The answer came at once, honest and ugly. But I wanted to. Obi-Wan thought of Maul, of Naboo, of the burning vacancy left by Qui-Gon's death that had once made him dream of vengeance, with an intensity he had never admitted aloud until the training Sal days ago. He placed one hand, careful, deliberate, on Anakin's shoulder. "So did I," he said. Anakin looked at him. "Not now," Obi-Wan added. "Then? When I was young and terrified and had just learned what rage feels like when it borrows righteousness. It is persuasive. That doesn't make it wise." Ugh. Rain from some higher leakage struck the bridge in slow, cold drops. Anakin's breath eased by increments. "I'm tired of arriving after the bodies," he said. "So am I." They stood that way a moment longer, two men on a narrow bridge over the Undercity, blue light fading from their sabers, steam and rain turning the world to ghosts. Then Obi-Wan crouched by the corpse and searched it with methodical hands. In an inner pocket he found a clean ident wafer linked to a shell security firm with executive contracting privileges. Above them, unseen beyond 1,000 levels of wealth and architecture, the Senate towers glittered. Rain crossed the temple windows in silver threads. Dawn on Corasont was less a sunrise than a gradual negotiation between artificial light and weather, the city brightening from within before any natural horizon could matter. Yoda stood alone for a time in a meditation chamber older than most of the surrounding complex, where the floor stones had been worn smooth by generations of bare feet and quiet grief. The force here did not feel clearer. Coruscant allowed no such luxury. But it felt layered, and in layers an old master could sometimes distinguish current from sediment. Dooku had been his student. That fact returned now not as nostalgia but as wound. There were failures one outlived, and failures one merely carried. Had he seen the aristocratic pride becoming disdain, the disdain hardening toward contempt, the contempt searching for a philosophy sharp enough to justify itself? Of course he had seen parts. A teacher always saw parts. The tragedy was never blindness entire. It was underestimating which fracture would widen first. He thought of Qui-Gon too. Independent, difficult, instinctive where the Council preferred consensus. If any among them had once sensed how deeply the Republic could be used against itself, it had been him. Yoda had often loved that in Qui-Gon, and often wished to correct it. Love and correction, he knew now, were not always friends. When the small gathering convened later that morning, it did so without formal announcement, without the council chamber, without any location grand enough to echo. Mace chose a disused strategy room in the lower temple reserved for crisis briefings during ancient wars. Its walls were thick. Its surveillance was internal and purged. Around the table sat Mace, Obi-Wan, Yoda, Padmé, Bail Organa, and at Yoda's insistence over Mace's initial silence, Anakin. Bail set a hand flat on the table. If what Senator Amidala found touches executive roots, then the Senate can no longer assume ordinary corruption. Nor extraordinary innocence, Padmé said. Mace activated the projector. Data from the Dead Aids crystal braided with the work's relay traces and Virlo's handshake timestamp. On another screen, the Geonosis hologram fragment flickered in patient blue corruption. Separate pieces, each too incomplete to accuse. Together, an outline. Obi-Wan spoke first, not as witness now but as analyst. Dooku, under the name Tyrannus, recruited Jango Fett for the clone army on one of the moons of Bogdan. Dooku serves a superior who discussed Senate behavior and deployments from Geonosis during the opening of the war. Kamino on contract extensions route through shell accounts tied to Senate appropriations and emergency discretionary funds. A frightened Senate aide discovered duplicate streams feeding corporate fronts connected to the Confederacy and died within a day. The works relay we recovered used executive-grade encryption families. A gunman connected to an executive contractor attempted to kill a witness, and before taking poison, claimed the hidden master walks above us every day. Which sounds dramatic enough to be true or false with equal ease, Bale said. Indeed, Obi-Wan replied. If I were constructing a deception, I might also arrange for frightened men to speak in riddles. But the pattern remains. Anakin had been silent longer than any of them expected, fingers folded against the edge of the table. His metal hand reflected projector light like pale water. You all keep circling the same word without saying it, he said finally. Chancellor. Mace looked at him. Because saying it changes the ground we stand on. Not saying it doesn't change it back. Padmé's gaze shifted to Anakin, not surprised exactly, but alert to the danger in his directness. Bale rubbed one temple. Suppose, he said carefully, that the Sith's influence reaches the Chancellor's office rather than residing in the Chancellor. The distinction matters. It does, Yoda agreed. And proof we need. Mace turned off the Geonosis fragment and the room darkened by a degree. From this point forward, we treat the Chancellor's inner administration as potentially compromised. We do not accuse. We do not confront. We watch, quietly, every route, every authorization, every contact with military procurement, with the banking interests, with Kamino, with the separatist corporate blocs. And if the hidden Sith is the Chancellor? Anakin asked. No one answered at once. If... Mace said at last, then we will know before we move. And when we move, we will not miss. Me. It was the kind of statement that should have reassured. Instead, it settled over the table like the shadow of a blade. After the meeting, Anakin was summoned to the Chancellor's office. The request came through channels so normal there was no refusing it without offense. Obi-Wan accompanied him as far as the waiting chamber, and then stopped. Remember, he said quietly, Palpatine has always tried to speak to you as if you stand apart from the Order. Listen for what he wants. No, Dabi, Andars, Gumshay, Asirish, Pa. What if what he wants is just a conversation? Obi-Wan's expression was almost sympathetic. Then we are living in more innocent times than I took this morning to indicate. Anakin entered alone. The Chancellor's office was a masterpiece of controlled symbolism. High windows over the city, warm wood against cool stone, antique statuary positioned with calculated restraint, lighting that made the room feel both intimate and enormous. Palpatine stood near a side table laid with tea. He wore no robe of office now, only dark senatorial garments that made him appear less a head of state than an elder scholar interrupted at reflection. Anakin, he said, smiling with what seemed like genuine pleasure. Come, I hope I have not stolen you from more valuable duties. Anakin's instincts warred. Years of habit told him this was safe ground, perhaps the safest outside Obi-Wan and Padmé. Recent weeks told him safe ground was exactly where the sinkholes had been dug. Nothing urgent, Chancellor. Good. Palpatine poured tea himself, a gesture of humility he knew people noticed. I wanted to see how you fare. Injuries of the body are straightforward enough. The rest of war is less obliging. Anakin accepted the cup. I'm fine. Of course. Palpatine's smile acknowledged the lie without exposing it. You are always fine when asked directly. It is one of your more exhausting virtues. The line would once have delighted him. Now he heard the shape of it. A private bond affirmed. A shared understanding set against the more formal distance of the Jedi. Obi-Wan had been right. Palpatine spoke not merely to comfort, but to separate. The Council keeps you busy? The Chancellor asked. We all have work. We all. Palpatine sipped his tea. Do forgive an old man's curiosity, but I wonder sometimes whether they appreciate you as they should. Institutions can be ungenerous toward those who exceed them. Anakin looked out at the city while buying a heartbeat to think. Below the office windows, air traffic moved in luminous streams around the Senate towers. Somewhere in that impossible depth, Padmé argued with committee chairs and Bail built coalitions and Mace set surveillance in motion, and the works hid its stripped machines. "The Order has its reasons," he said. "Reasons." Palpatine set the cup down. "Yes, a word often used when affection would be more honest. There it was again, offered like a hand. In another life, or the same life a month earlier, Anakin might have taken it fully, might have poured out the grievance of being mistrusted, of being judged for feeling too much, of being told patience by men who had never wanted anything enough to fear its loss. The grievances still existed. What had changed was that he now understood them as doors someone else might open from the outside. He turned back from the window. "Master Obi-Wan appreciates me," he said. Something flickered in Palpatine's gaze. Not anger, too disciplined for that, but a measured recalculation. "Does he?" "Yes." "And do you believe the Council shares his view?" Anakin thought of the strategy room, of Yoda insisting he be included, of Mace meeting his gaze without contempt, of Obi-Wan telling him the whole poem of Geonosis instead of reducing it to anger. "Not always," he said, "but more than they used to." Palpatine smiled. "Then the war has improved something at least." When Anakin left, tea untouched except for politeness, Palpatine remained by the window long after the door closed. The conversation had not gone badly. It had simply failed to go where it should have. The boy's grievance had been banked, not extinguished. Someone had brought him nearer the center instead of leaving him to circle it in loneliness. Palpatine's reflection in the transparent steel looked older for a moment than the face beneath it. Below, rain resumed over Corasont. The final fragment from Geonosis arrived at the temple near midnight. It came not from a breakthrough but from patience. R2-D2, offended by the limitations of organic technicians and deeply convinced of his own superiority, had inserted himself into the restoration work whenever anyone turned away long enough for it to be impolite to stop him. By the time a harried slicer summoned Obi-Wan to the analysis chamber, the astromech was perched atop 3 stacked cases, chirping with the smug cadence of a being who expected gratitude and intended to make the waiting for it unbearable. Obi-Wan entered with Anakin a step behind and found Mace and Yoda already present. The chamber was small, windowless, lit mostly by consoles. R2 rotated once in place as if presenting a completed sculpture. The slicer bowed hurriedly. "We recovered a few seconds more, Masters. Not much, but enough to stabilize the secondary image layer." Mace nodded. "Show us." The projector came alive. Blue static. Dooku's profile. Clearer this time, the severe line of nose and beard no longer a blur but a man. Across from him, the hooded superior. The voice emerged first, textured now with more human timbre beneath distortion, low and controlled. "The banking clan is prepared. The Senatus resistance will fold once the casualty reports begin." Dooku inclined his head within the image. "And the Chancellor?" The hooded figure turned slightly. For one impossible fraction of a second, the projection caught not a face but a reflected environment. A high, curved window, night lights below, the edge of a sculpted bronze chair arm identical to those used in certain executive suites. Then the voice again, colder for having briefly almost belonged somewhere real. "The Chancellor will ask only for what the frightened are already begging him to accept." A crackle. Dooku said, "The Jedi may suspect. They suspect many things. That is why they fail." The recording ended. No one spoke at first. Anakin stared at the frozen afterimage of hood and reflected glass. Obi-Wan felt the blood in his body go strangely quiet, as if listening more carefully than the mind could. The words were not proof of identity. They did not place Palpatine beneath the hood, not in law, not in a court, not before the Senate. But they narrowed the universe of possibility to a space small enough to suffocate in. "The Chancellor will ask only for what the frightened are already begging him to accept," Mace repeated. Yoda's face had become old in a way age alone did not account for. "Near the center, the shadow stands. Anakin looked from the projection to Mace. "It's him." "It is not enough to say that," Mace replied. "It's enough to know it." "It is enough," Mace said, every word clipped to discipline, "to suspect that the hidden Sith either is the Chancellor or operates from within the innermost architecture of his office. It is enough to justify surveillance of every channel he touches. It is enough to assume that any direct warning to the Senate would reach him before it reached justice. It is not enough to arrest the head of the Republic on the basis of a damaged Wardim recording." Anakin's frustration flared, and then checked itself against the steel in Mace's voice. Obi-Wan saw the effort, and that mattered more than the frustration. "Then what do we do?" Anakin asked. "We prepare," Mace said. The word hung in the room like a drawn line. Over the next hours, they built the hidden campaign that would run beneath the visible war. Temple Watchers were reassigned in secrecy. Every interaction between the Chancellor's office and military procurement would be copied through channels known only to Mace and a handful of trusted analysts. Bail Organa agreed to widen Senate scrutiny without ever naming its true object, letting committees and procedural demands become camouflage for investigation. Padmé, informed before dawn through a coded message, returned confirmation that several executive aides had already begun quietly shredding archival redundancies. Obi-Wan and Anakin would continue tracing Tyrannosa's outer network, bankers, couriers, corporate intermediaries, bounty contacts, while appearing to accept ordinary military assignments. Yoda would probe Kamino more deeply, especially the hidden medical architecture in the clones. "Tell the others?" Obi-Wan asked at one point. "The full council, yes," Mace said. "The full order, no. Not yet. Panic becomes rumor. Rumor becomes warning." "And Palpatine?" Anakin said, using the name openly in private for the first time. Mace's eyes shifted to him. "You will treat him exactly as before." The instruction landed with peculiar force. Anakin had not realized until then how much of him wanted immediate confrontation. Not necessarily violence, though that impulse glimmered at the edges, but clarity. To stand before the smiling elder statesman and say, "I know what you are." To tear the veil and see whether there was a man behind it or only appetite. Obi-Wan seemed to understand without looking directly at him. "We are not powerless because we wait," he said quietly. Anakin almost answered that waiting was another kind of powerlessness, when one's enemy used every hour. He stopped himself. Obi-Wan was right, and the fact that he was right did not make the truth easier to bear. Near dawn, the others dispersed. Mace went to coordinate surveillance. Yoda vanished into meditation and data in equal measure. Obi-Wan remained in the analysis chamber with Anakin and R2, who had finally stopped boasting long enough to power down against the wall in a self-satisfied doze. The chamber lights had dimmed. Beyond its sealed doors, the temple moved toward morning routines. Younglings waking, initiates crossing courtyards, masters pretending to ordinary schedules while the foundations of the Republic shifted beneath them. Obi-Wan sat on the edge of a table and rubbed one hand over his eyes. "You should sleep," Anakin said. "You should sleep," Obi-Wan replied. "I'm not the one who lost to Dooku twice in a month." Obi-Wan lowered his hand and gave him a look. "You are very fortunate I'm too tired to be offended elegantly." Anakin's mouth twitched despite everything. The silence that followed was not empty. It had become, over the past weeks, something different from the brittle pauses that once opened between them whenever judgment or impatience flared. It had become inhabited. "Do you think it's really him?" Anakin asked at last. Obi-Wan considered denying certainty and deference to caution and chose honesty instead. "I think the galaxy has grown much smaller than I would like." Anakin leaned against the opposite console, metal fingers drumming once against the casing. "He's been talking to me for years." "Yes. He knew about my mother." Obi-Wan's face changed slightly. "Anakin. No, I know you didn't know all of it." He looked at the dark projector. "That's the part I hate most. Not that he might be a Sith. That he might have been there every time I thought I was being seen." Obi-Wan rose from the table and crossed to him. "Then hold to the people who truly do see you," he said. Do not give him the gift of making every kindness feel counterfeit. It was a simple sentence. Anakin felt it more sharply than any maxim. Because it came not from a council seat or a doctrine holocron, but from the man who had pulled him out of childhood and, despite all their fractures, never truly stopped trying. Far away on Sereno, Count Dooku stood before another secure transmission. Sidious appeared in blue shadow, hood low, the connection distorted by layers of encryption. "The Jedi have increased scrutiny," Sidious said. Dooku did not feign surprise. "So I expected after Geonosis. How much did they recover?" "Not enough to be dangerous," Dooku answered, and hated the lie less now that he knew why he told it. The hood did not move. "See that it remains so. The next phase begins regardless. Grievous will be activated sooner than planned." Dooku inclined his head. "As you wish, my master." When the transmission ended, he remained in the dark study, candle burning beside him, and wondered whether he had just saved himself or doomed himself more completely. Grievous. Escalation. More war. Sidious was closing ranks through action, which meant he felt pressure. Good. Pressure clarified. On Corasont, in the highest office of the Republic, Palpatine stood alone after dismissing Mace Windu and Sly Moore. The city spread beneath him in 1,000 illuminated arteries. He looked not at the Senate spire, not at the temples, not at the monuments to Republican virtue, but into the great descending maze where wealth turned to industry and industry, to darkness and darkness to forgotten foundations. Somewhere down there and everywhere up here, the first error had been committed. Not by him, by Dooku perhaps, by chance, by the Force, if one preferred mysticism to diagnostics. The Jedi had taken the bait of truth without swallowing its shape whole. Worse, they had not splintered over it as expected. Kenobi had been quicker, Windu more cautious, Yoda less willing to trust institutional inertia. Skywalker, most irritating of all, had been drawn inward rather than estranged. For the first time since Geonosis, Palpatine allowed himself the luxury of naming the problem plainly. The war had begun under favorable conditions, but it would not, perhaps, be as simple as planned. He touched 2 fingers to the windows and watched rain thread downward over the glass. Behind him, the office remained immaculate, every object in its ordained place. Before him, Corasont glittered like a crown over an abyss. Somewhere within the temple, Jedi who believed themselves hunters had just realized the beast lived in the palace. Somewhere on Sereno, Dooku tended ambitions he no longer entirely understood. Somewhere inside Anakin Skywalker, loyalty and fear and love had begun to arrange themselves in patterns less convenient than destiny required. Morning light gathered by degrees over the city and failed to make it innocent. In the temple, as the first bells of the day sounded, Mace Windu issued sealed orders that would never appear in official records. Yoda redirected inquiries toward Kamino's hidden medical protocols. Bail Organa entered the Senate chamber with new questions sharpened behind old manners. Padmé Amidala sat before a bank of committee reports and, without once speaking the Chancellor's name, began dismantling the comfort of those who had hidden behind procedure. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker walked side by side through the temple hangar toward awaiting transport. Master and apprentice no longer divided by the same easy silences that had once made them vulnerable to other voices. The Clone Wars still spread. Fleets still mobilized. Worlds still burned. The Republic still applauded its own militarization because fear had asked it to and fear was persuasive. None of that changed with dawn. What changed was this. The shadow was no longer abstract. It had a voice. It had roots. It had habits. It had grown so near the center of power that the men and women who served the Republic could feel its breath in the machinery. And once a hidden enemy is felt, truly felt, it ceases to be myth and becomes a problem. That was how empires were prevented before they were born. Not by purity, not by certainty, by the hard and terrible moment when enough people, in enough rooms, stopped pretending the dark was elsewhere. The rain kept falling over Corasont as if the planet itself were trying to wash a face no one had yet dared to name.